sharing my screen?
Yeah, I think I'm recording now.
Okay, great. Oh, hang on. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our workshop about genetic modification, the how-to and the whys. Genetic modification is a term which is used quite often in discussions or the news and has sort of, the people are against it or are pro. And we hope with this workshop to teach you why people would not like GMOs and why GMOs could potentially save the world. So I'm Samira and my colleague is...
Yeah, I'm Victoria.
And we're from the team Amsterdam for the iGEM 2020 synthetic biology competition. And we're working a lot with genetic modification. It's sort of our main business. So we hope after this workshop you will understand also a bit why we use this small beasts, as I like to call them. But before we start, we want to like monitor where you are at the moment. What do you already know? So we prepared a little Kahoot. The pin is in the title of the slide. So if you could join, please. Then we will start the Kahoot with the nice music. Okay, we have 2 players. I think we're all settled. Okay, let's start. The first question. Are you familiar with the term genetic modification? Okay, I have to think. Okay, oh, everyone is familiar with genetic modification.
Kun says he can't see answer options.
What?
On my screen, I can only see sort of the symbols of what to answer, but not what the symbols represent. So I had a guess with this question, to be honest.
Shall I name them? Because I thought if I share my screen, you would see it, but apparently you don't. So.
Ah, no, I can't.
Okay, for the next question, I will say out loud what the answers are. Okay, the next question is, what rate in a scale to 1 to 4 do you give to your current knowledge about genetic modification? Red is 1, I don't know anything about genetic modification. Blue, 2, I know something about genetic modification. 3 is yellow, I know quite a lot about genetic modification. And 4, green, I know everything. Okay, so we have sort of a varied public. That's good. Next. Is it better now, Koen?
Yes, it's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Next one. Which word describes your opinion about genetic modification the best? And then we have red, negative, blue, positive, orange, neutral. Okay, most of us are positive. That's great. And someone is neutral. Don't mind the scores. Which is the first application which pops to your mind when thinking of genetic modification? And you don't have to answer this question. Please type it into the chat. Okay, what answers do we get? Vicky, could you read them out maybe?
Yep, we have food and improvement of crops, food, etc.
Okay, yeah. That's good. Well, now we know what and you maybe know also a bit better what your general knowledge about genetic modification is. We want to introduce you to the topics of our webinar. First, well, after our Kahoot, first we're going to talk a bit about genetic modification in general. What are the definitions? How is it being performed? What are the methods and the applications? Then we're going to have a short overview of some arguments which are used in the discussion about genetic modification. And then in the end, we end up again with the Kahoot to see whether your opinion might be changed. And for our entire presentation, we have a specific setup. First, on every topic, we will present in 5 to 10 minutes the main topics. And then afterwards, we're going to have a small discussion about what you've just learned. So you can, you yourself can really think of what does it mean to me when listening to our presentation. And because we want your opinion, we want to know what you think is valuable. Let's start with the introduction to genetic modification. Let's see if I can. Well, first we started with some definitions. Well, genetic modification has a lot of different definitions, and it's being used in different topics on different ways. But for the purpose of this presentation, we will define genetic modification quite broad as the area of biotechnology which concerns itself with the manipulation of genetic material in living organisms, enabling them to perform specific functions. So it's not only what most people think of directly genetic modification in the lab, but it has to do just changing genetic material in a way which is beneficial for our purposes. And because genetic modification is applied in organisms, and genetically modified organisms, the concept, we try to narrow it down a bit more. So the definition of genetic modification is an organism, with the exception of human beings, in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating or natural recombination. But be aware that these definitions are just the definitions we use here. In the discussions, there are many different definitions being used, and that can be quite confusing, so just be aware. First, I will introduce you a bit to the methods which are used for genetic modification. And I start off in with history, because for ages, people already tried to select the traits which they like in the crops and then made two individuals with these specific traits. For example, here you see some grain growing, and the fastest and longest growing grain is being selected and mated. And from that, a new population arises with some taller, some faster growing grain plants. And this procedure is repeated until a population arises which has the traits you want. So very long and fast growing grain. A second step is to combine specific traits and to get one output. For example, you want to have a bigger, sweeter apple. So you get a bigger apple and a sweeter apple. You mate them, and then after many generations, you get the bigger, sweeter fruit. This is called selective breeding, because you select traits, you combine them, and you get some nice results. But these methods are quite slow, so people try to come up with something which might, speed up the process a bit. And one thing they came up with is mutagenesis. It's a very complicated word, but the essentials is that you perform some very harsh method, you perform some harsh, for example, X-ray or chemical mutagenesis to, for example, seeds or anything else that can grow later on to create mutants with specific, maybe some weird traits, some weird phenotype, and you select the traits you like, again, like in selection. By adding the sort of the extra layer with the X-ray or chemical manipulation, you create more chance that you have a trait you like. And the more used method of genetic modification is actually more targeted. So you have a fruit and you want to make it, for example, insect resistant. And to get this insect resistance trait, you introduce a gene which you know is making sure that it is responsible for insect resistance, and you can get this gene from another fruit or a bacteria or whatever. And then you introduce it to your original fruit, and then in the end you have your insect resistant apple in this case. So for the main difference between the old methods, the traditional methods, and the new methods is that the old methods are sort of random. You combine two genomes to traits and like two beats of strings, the way you want to see it, and you get your desired gene and other genes, but you don't know what. While for the modern methods of genetic modification, you just take your desired gene, introduce it to your target genome, and you get your desired organism with your desired trait, your desired gene. And with these methods, you can do a lot of different things, and Vicky is going to tell you more about it.
Yes, so today GMOs are already, genetic modified organisms are already being used for the production of different compounds with a varied range of applications that go from food to even ion batteries. So the first organisms to be genetically modified were bacteria. And in fact, most of our understanding of molecular biology comes from E. coli, which despite being able to cause some nasty infection in humans, can also be used for the production of extremely scarce and valuable animal or human proteins, such as hormones, blood clotting factors, and even antibodies. So an example is the first medicinal use of genetic modified bacteria was to produce the protein insulin, which is used to treat diabetes. And amongst other medicines produced by genetic modification, there are growth hormone for the treatment of dwarfism and erythropoietin for anemic patients. And likewise, yeast are also used to produce a wide variety of pharmaceutical products. Next, please. Another application is biofuels. Bacteria and yeast can be genetically modified to produce biofuels. They show a good potential because circular production can be achieved. So this means that since biofuel is made by capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide that's released when the biofuel is burned can be then reused by bacteria or yeast to make more fuel. Next, please. Then we have food and beverages. So most food-producing bacteria are now lactic acid bacteria, and this is where the majority of the research into genetically engineering food-producing bacteria has gone. So these bacteria are used as flavor enhancers and also as producers of artificial sweeteners, such as mannitol, sorbitol, and xylitol. Likewise, yeast have been especially important for wine production in the US and Canada, where two organisms are used. One of them increases the fermentation efficiency and the other one prevents the production of dangerous compounds during the fermentation process. And we also have a very interesting application, which is bioremediation. So this is an example where bacteria convert pollutants into a less toxic form. Genetic engineering can increase the levels of enzymes used to degrade a toxin or to make bacteria more stable in some environmental conditions. So genetically engineered bacteria could be, for example, used to clean oil spoilages in water sources by converting hydrocarbon waste to harmless gases. And finally, we have viruses. So viruses can be used to insert DNA into any organism, which is very relevant for its potential in treating human disease. Although primarily these are trials, there has been some success in using gene therapy to replace effective genes in treatments for diseases like glioblastoma, cystic fibrosis, and some cancers. So what happens here is that the damaged gene can be replaced for a healthy one by the introduction of a genetically modified virus. And then there's this example in MIT where a research group works with the application of genetically modified viruses to build conductive nanomaterials. And they have, for example, built a lithium-ion battery using genetically modified viruses. And now we would like to discuss a little bit with you after what we have told you. So we have a few questions. Now that you know how genetic modification works, do you think that the genetic modification techniques are an improvement to what we used to have before? Yeah, you could unmute yourself and just give us an answer.
It does sound a lot more more targeted, at least. You can be much more specific rather than just having like the mutagenesis example where you have some side damage as well. So that sounds a good improvement.
Yeah, and do you also think that, for example, the applications which were mentioned, do you think they might help us in the future in developing a better and just more sustainable world?
Oh yes, it does sound very promising indeed. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And our next question is, do you feel comfortable if you knew that these techniques were being used in the future?
Yeah, I think that having good information about the exact details would give a lot of comfort, probably, as long as it's not too unknown or too secretive, and people understand what's going on, then it probably they can accept it as well.
And you yourself, do you feel comfortable if you, for example, knew that your ion battery would be made by viruses? Would you use that?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
You wouldn't think of how it's made. It's just about what the product is.
No, I mean, you would know how it's made, right? But even after that, you would still think of, okay, yes, let's use this.
Okay, great. That's good. Well, thank you for your opinion. I'm sorry there are not a lot of people to discuss it with, but thank you. Let's continue with our presentation. And now it's about the arguments in the genetic modification discussion. Vicky is going to tell you a bit about the cons, or the pros of genetic modification. What do people think? Why do people think it's good?
Okay, so what are the pros of genetic modification? So first, we have higher productivity per unit area. And here, this is mostly about biofuels. So algae biofuels avoid some of the drawbacks that are associated with crop-based biofuels, as they do not compete with food crops. So liquid fuels obtained from crops of maize, soy, or palm can promote competition between the use of these crops for food and also the competition for agricultural land used to produce food crops, which could then lead to increased deforestation. So the third generation biofuels, which are those produced by microalgae organisms, have the potential for deriving higher productivity per unit area and avoid the direct competition with food crops. Then we have that safety is considered and assessed. So GMOs are actually developed under very controlled conditions, and an assessment of their possible repercussions is always taken into account before these organisms are allowed to leave the labs. This means that safety is greatly considered when working with genetically modified organisms, which in turn results in a reduced risk of undesirable effects. And then we have the potential of carbon dioxide capture and storage. So growing microalgae, for example, could be an important tool in combating global CO2 emissions. This is due to their ability to act as carbon dioxide fixation sources as they convert the CO2 into biomass, which means they use it for their growth. So algae ponds could be located close to CO2 emission plants where gases can be pumped directly to these ponds and then used by algae for photosynthesis. And then finally, we have the ability to break down many compounds. So this, it turns out that the broadest spectrum in metabolic activities is found in microorganisms, which shows their potential to be engineered to produce a larger spectrum of compounds in more sustainable ways than the ones that are used nowadays.
Yay. Well, but why do people feel so reluctant to use genetic modified organisms then? Because there's quite a big group, especially in more the environmental side, who think like, genetic modification, I don't know. Well, let's start out with most used arguments is the religious and ethical, are they religious and ethical consideration. People think that like playing for God might be unethical. You can't just change nature. Just introduce something foreign into an organism. For many people, that doesn't feel right. It's more that they don't agree on it on a maybe a religious perspective. And as well, that another con might be that effects can be unpredictable. Organisms are quite complex. They are composed of different networks, as we call them, and it's very intertwined. So if you change one thing, you can be quite sure that you don't change the other, something else. But there's always a risk that there is something happening which you're actually not knowing of. And that's also why it's very hard to predict long-term effects, although many studies have shown that there are no long-term effects at all, or very little, or maybe not even negative ones, but only positive ones. You never know how it's going to be in 100 years and how fast the development is going to be. For example, what would happen if they escape the lab? Would they change the environment? Would they change the ecosystem? Would they maybe even outgrow the natural population? And another big challenge is that some of these genetically modified organisms, or GMOs as we call them, they can transfer their genes to a normal organism. And in this process of what they call horizontal gene transfer might ensure that in the end there's no wild-type normal population anymore and there's only GMO. And that's, of course, that's not something we would like. But then the question remains if these organisms can survive outside the lab, because most of them, they just die very fast after they're out of their protected environment. But still, you never know for sure. Well, and this brings us to the end of the genetic of our arguments. Well, and now we would like to know if you think if the cons outweigh the pros, or maybe the other way around.
I think that overall it sounds like there is more potential for good than sort of risk of negative effects. I think what does sound like a concern is, of course, the situation that you would have, let's say, an organism escape a controlled environment, because animals will always have this risk of, what is it? Animals from a completely different environment taking over. But if you say that often these organisms require very specific environments to actually survive, then that sounds like less of a challenge, of course. So then it does sound very promising, especially when you talk about, let's say, CO2 capture.
Yeah. And what's now your personal opinion about genetic modification? I hear from your argument before that you were quite positive. Would you think about maybe developing it further, and what applications would you first focus on, or what wouldn't you like to have? Maybe there's some application you wouldn't like.
Ooh. Well, it's difficult to say, I think. I can't immediately think of certain applications that I wouldn't want to see, for example. At least nothing comes to mind, so.
Well, that's good. Because genetic modification, and especially with what we are developing, it might be possible to produce a lot of, well, for example, biodiesels while capturing CO2, and you have a nice circle and everybody's happy.
So this means that you wouldn't care to see that some product that you use, or yeah, whether it is food or yeah, something you just use on your everyday life, if it contains a genetically modified organism product, would you mind?
Well, as long as it is being safely tested and considered safe, then no, that would not be a concern. I think the argument that something would be unnatural would not necessarily sort of stop me from yeah, no, and I think there's already examples in, what is it, foods products where specific, let's say, sweeteners or colors are produced by GMOs. So just purely that it is unnatural is not for me a negative thing.
Okay, good. Well, I'm happy to hear that you're positive about genetic modification. But yeah. Well, let's see how much you've learned during this this webinar. So let's start our Kahoot again. And it's, oh wait, it's the same. This is stupid. I forgot to. Hang on. I have to restart it. Sorry. Okay, this is the game pin. If you could please add yourself. Great. Then we start. Okay, are you ready? So, are you familiar with the term genetic modifications? I hope you all are. So, red is yes and blue is no. Okay, some are still not familiar with genetic modification, as we see. And how do you rate your current knowledge about genetic modification? Is that red, 1, I don't know anything. 2, blue, I know something. Yellow is 3, I know quite a lot. And green is 4, I know everything about genetic modification. Okay, still something unknown, but I think it's better than before. Which word describes your opinion about genetic modification the best? Is it red, negative, blue, positive, and yellow, neutral? So overall it's positive, that's good. And which application pops in your mind when thinking of genetic modification? And again, please write it into the chat. So let's get this. So I will go back to the presentation. Okay.
Yeah, so Koen says that the environmental applications are new to him. And so, yeah, that's a very, very nice answer.
Yeah, that's good. I'm happy that we've taught you something. Okay, well, in the end, we can conclude that genetic modification has good potential to deliver compounds of interest. And the cons do not seem to outweigh the pros, especially knowing how rigorous the design and implementation of GMOs can be. And that people might, and well, we are open to the use of GMO products. So now we all love this wonderful microbes. And if there's anything we could improve on our presentation, we would love to hear. We want your feedback because we are here all to learn, and not only you guys. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you in the next webinar, which will be taking place in a month exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.